Welcome to Feminism Today, everyone. I'm Sophia Johnson in New York. So, who owns the narrative about single mothers in the United States? If the past few weeks are any indication, it's educated, white, married people who are leading the current debate around single parenting and marriage rather than single mothers themselves. My guest this week is Tanzina Vega, journalist, former host of WNYC's The Takeaway, and author of a bold new op ed titled, What Do Single Mothers Really Need? And hint, it isn't marriage. Tanzina Vega, welcome to Feminism Today.
Thank you, Sophia. Thanks for having me.
So, the narrative is not working for a lot of American women. Tell us why.
Well, I think the first part about this conversation really for me started when there was a new book that came out called The Two-Parent Privilege. It was written by an economist whose name is Melissa Kearney. And her, very correct assessment is that the more people are being who are married, who are in dual income married households, have an economic and to a certain in her mind a social advantage over children who are being raised in single parent households. Now, that economically generally is true. Two incomes are more than one, right?
Mhm.
When we add it up, that seems pretty obvious. My challenge with the premise is that we now in the United States are the country with the largest percentage of children who are being raised in single parent households, right? So about 30% of children are in that situation. Now we can talk about why and how, and we can talk about the different permutations that lead to that. But at the end of the day, this is a major population shift. And it's not going away. So it's something that we have to address. And I think it's not being addressed by the broader conversations about dual parent households versus single parent households.
Yeah. So, point well taken. Melissa Kearney sort of missed a beat or two in that particular analysis. I get that. The op ed published in the Boston Globe completely nailed the question, though, I must say. Why did you write this article?
Well, I'm a single mom, and I think that, for starters, we don't hear as often about, you mentioned my working at the Takeaway in WNYC, like, that was a very public role, for me. I'm a Puerto Rican woman, not many of us at that level, often in journalism, and so, becoming a mom later in life and at that level was a pretty big deal for me, and I made the decision when, we didn't have a COVID-19 pandemic, right? I thought, okay, who had that on the brain, right? On your lottery ticket, so to speak. So I've been affected by this issue directly on many sides of the equation, right? I wasn't somebody who is destitute in having a child. I made a decision to have a child, with what I thought was a solid economic, footing that I was on at the time. And then we had a pandemic and everybody's life in some way, shape, or form was transformed. But what really opened my eyes was how I was treated often, during my pregnancy, even by people who you would suspect are, pretty progressive. Some of the awkward moments, some of the things that were said or asked, some Google searches about my name. And then really reading this as a woman in her late 40s and saying, wait a minute, it's not that simple. Right? It's not so simple to suggest that now it's true, what Melissa Kearney is saying is true, right? Two parents, two household, two incomes usually are better than one. We can discuss, whether those two people should be together. There are many reasons why people shouldn't be together, but economically speaking, she's right, and she's an economist. What I feel is missing are the voices of single parents themselves, right? Let us have these conversations. Let us talk about what's working for us and what isn't.
Let's dig in a little bit. What is working for single women or single mothers in the United States and what's not working?
Well, let's start with what's not working. The fact is that we are looking at a judiciary in the Supreme Court here in this country that has really undone many of the things that would support, what this a lot of this call for not having as many, children raised by single parents, right? We've seen the undoing of affirmative action. We've seen the undoing of Roe v. Wade. And those are two really big protections on both sides. See, I don't look at the equation simply as something of two parents coming together. What we're missing in this conversation, what we tend to miss in the United States, is a conversation about class. And it's a conversation about wealth. It may, there are single women who are deciding to have children who are very, secure in that decision and who are making the call financially to do that. There are others who said, didn't plan it this way. This is how it turned out, and it's pretty tough. We need to acknowledge the fact that while we as a society maybe be more accepting of single parents, right? We're still not 100% there. And that's why I say things aren't working. We don't have childcare, structured childcare in this country. All parents were suffering from that lack of childcare during the pandemic. But I think single parents in particular don't have, an another set of hands often. So we've seen the undoing of that. We've also seen the undoing of a lot of COVID era protections, financial protections, child tax credits, the undoing of some children who were in poverty because of some of the stimulus money that went towards families. So there were lots of things that happened during the pandemic in particular that were sort of helping to a certain extent to ameliorate some of the poverty issues that we talk about because single parents also are more likely to live in poverty. And now we've seen that, we've essentially seen those protections taken away and those credits taken away. So we're in a moment when you add to that the fact that women, but mostly women of color, and I mean Black women in particular, Latina women to a slightly lesser extent, in particular, are also paid devastatingly less than white women are, right? So we have a disadvantage from the beginning, in terms of closing that economic gap that I think that Professor Kearney, missed in her analysis.
To your point, a lot of economists tend to write that the situation is most favorable for family rearing in a marriage, however defined. You write single parents don't need marriage, however, we need better policies. What type of policies in particular would support single mothers in the United States?
We need some sort of systemized childcare. We act in this country, there's often memes that say people have to act like they work like they don't have kids and parent like they don't have a job, right? And that's just not realistic. It's only realistic for those of us who are making very good money, right? Frankly, if you can afford to hire, a nanny and someone to travel with you. I've seen people who have nannies that travel with them when they have to go on business trips. I think that's fabulous. But that is so inaccessible for so many people, right? It's just not a reality for a lot of people. Most people need a place for their child to be, taken care of, be safe while they go to work. I mean, we're in a country that requires us to work. So in order for us to do that, we need the supports to make that happen. That would benefit single parents in particular, but all parents would benefit from that. Right now, parents are spending upwards of $1,500 a month on daycare for one child. That doesn't include 2 children. That does and that cost could go on for 2 to 3 years at best. And so we really need to consider childcare as the first thing. We also need to get wage parity. The idea that, often people I'll tell people about, when there was a moment when I was making the best money in my life, right? And that was when I chose to have a child. So you make a decision saying, I think I'm going to be able to afford this. At the same time, that economic blip that some of us experience, where we do have moments of economic, abundance or security, doesn't make up for the generational wealth that's missing for a lot, right? So let's say you get to a place where you're making $200,000 a year, which is for so many, I mean, that's just so much money for a lot of people. But if you don't come from generational wealth, that money is really all you've got to work with and build on, and so you're missing, so we need to create programs that, A, close that economic gap for women, but really particularly women of color. And Black and Latina women are paid, 67 to 57 cents on the dollar that every white man is paid, and white women aren't closing the gap, but they make a little bit more when it comes to the gap. So those are, I think, 2 things that have to be addressed right away.
These policies that you've described falls in the hand or the responsibility of government, or is it corporation?
I'm so glad you asked that question because I ask that question all the time, actually. I wanna know. I've asked, Elliot Haspel is sort of an expert nationally on childcare. I'm sure you've heard of him. And I asked him straight out, I said, "Whose responsibility is it? Is it the government's responsibility? Is it the private sector's responsibility?" And he thinks that childcare should be accessible, but who should pay for it is the tricky part, right? Consider your job, for example, paying for your childcare. That's great, but in many ways, that's like our healthcare. Once you lose the job, you lose the care, right? And so I would love to see models where we are incentivizing, childcare services so that the workers are protected, so that they're paid fairly, so that they're not, abused in their workplaces. But also, is that the federal government? I would love to know, would love to experiment and see what the federal government and local and state governments want to do, because there was a point when they were involved in this conversation, right? When in the 1970s and 60s, when this conversation was happening about providing childcare, here in New York City, we have something called 3K, which was something that Bill de Blasio, former mayor, made sure to implement. And that is the year before pre K, right? And that is a free childcare, that's a free education, Department of Education benefit for New York City parents. Some people will not move out of the city because they have free 3K, sorry. So, programs like that, we can be creative. If we can find money to do certain things, we can find money to do other things. I worry about it being connected. I don't say we shouldn't have companies that offer that type of care, particularly companies where they're asking you to be on call, or they're asking you to, drop everything at a moment's notice. I'm thinking, healthcare providers. I'm thinking journalists, for example. But more traditional childcare, I think, should be provided in some form so that people can access it, and that whether that's through the government, we'll see.
Let's talk a little bit about the mental load of parenting. What do you mean when you say parenting, it feels like the end of time?
The past few years have been climactic without appearing without seemingly any end, to it all, and some of it has been pretty scary. And so what I wanted to do in that column was, A, acknowledge the concern, acknowledge the fear, acknowledge the fact that, yes, this is happening, you're not crazy, like, we're all sort of feeling this is a little unstable right now, but the idea came to me when we had in New York City, we had something on the West Coast that happens on the West Coast all the time, which is the air and the sky turned bright orange in the middle of summer, and it was from wildfire smoke. And we in the city had not experienced that the way they've experienced it on the West Coast. And I remember looking at my son, who was 3 years old, and I said, he wanted to sit outside and watch the cars. And I said, we can't because the air is bad. And and it felt so apocalyptic in that moment. The sky is orange. I'm, like, putting a mask around his face. I'm showing him that we can't be outside, and I think that was a moment when I thought, "Oh my gosh, that this is not." I mean, parenting has never been easy, but doing it when you're thinking about things like the sky is orange. The country's on fire, right? Like, we're constantly coming up with, and confronting what feels like a never-ending, stream of really difficult things, and you look at kids, especially younger kids, and you think, "Okay, let's, have some ice cream while the world is on fire," right? It's almost like you have to split your brain in a way, and yet you can't. You're the adult, so you're the one that has to deal with the onslaught of information, and that can be hard, while you're also trying to think about what's for dinner.
You just talked a little bit about universal pre-K and in New York in particular, and how the value that would add to the quality of life for single women, but families in general. I want to talk a little bit about poverty and the financial fragility of single parents who need childcare, but who need so much more.
Again, we don't like to talk about class in the United States. We like to talk about a meritocracy. We like to talk about, you can, if you work hard, you'll make it. And I don't want to dissuade anyone from working hard and trying to make it. I did, right? The same. I had similar dreams. And so I don't want to say, no, 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 don't work hard and think you'll make it. But I think what we lack, especially in our analysis in the media of societal issues, is a real understanding of what it means to be poor, what it means to really be working class and not be able to get one foot up. And for some people, the cost of childcare is just prohibitive. I mean, there are people who have said, "Does it even make sense for me to pay a daycare if all I'm gonna do is go and make $15 an hour," right? And you really do have to think about that. Like, on the one hand, we're talking about, again, back to, Melissa Kearney's book, about the benefit of two high earning or two parent households that have two incomes and can offer all this stuff. But if you have one parent who is caught in a cycle of poverty, and we can talk about how that happens so much more easily for people of color. We can talk about the wealth gap. We can talk about the lack of generational wealth. This is not a question of people who don't work hard. This is a question of people who are not given the supports that they need. Because if you ask any parent who is, dual income and able to send their kids to school, to fancier schools, et cetera, they rely on a plethora of help, right? It's not just the parent. I'm sure there's the nanny. I'm sure there's the test prep person, right? I'm sure there are tons of resources for people that have money. And that's really what this is about. And people who don't have it, it's not for not trying, for lack of work. We simply don't have a structure that benefits single earners and single parents. Let's talk about taxes. I'm not a tax code expert whatsoever, but I am sure that there are ways that we can work the tax code to better support independent head of household and single parents, right? Are there tax credits that can go towards, we've had the child tax credit back and forth, and it's almost like a whim that people sort of decide, yeah, let's, but there are people who are really trying to make change. There's been discussion, for example, about baby bonds in certain cities around the country to close the racial wealth gap. There's been discussion about universal basic income, job security. Like these are real things that have to happen for people in the margins, and the lowest income Americans need to do in order to support the families that they have a right to have, right? And so I think that's really what's at issue here is that, employment at that level is very hard. Wages are not, there's still states that are fighting for minimum $15 an hour wage, so we've really gotta think about how we treat the working class and, poor Americans, and how we support them or not, and how we support, their children.
I want to talk for a couple of minutes about parenting. These questions are for all the single ladies. Just parenting as a single woman. And I bring this up because you were quarantined with a newborn when you wrote that op-ed in New York Times alone. Let's talk a little bit about what those experiences are like, what to expect if you're thinking about going down this road. Let's have a reality conversation for women who are contemplating this path.
So the first thing I always tell women is that you can become a single mom in a variety of different ways. Sometimes you plan it, sometimes you don't, right? So single parenthood is not is sometimes a choice, sometimes, it's a consequence or it's something that happens. You can become a single parent through widow to becoming a widow, through divorce, through your own, decision making and saying, I'm going to go and I'm going to, get IVF, and I'm going to take it totally into my own hands and I'm going to make this proactive choice. You can become a single parent because you happen to be pregnant and your relationship doesn't work out, right? Which happens. And so this notion that there's only one way to get there, I think is now each one of those scenarios is a different scenario. It brings with it a different, sometimes different questions, different needs, different responsibilities. But generally speaking, there's not one way to get there, right? There are many ways that it can happen to you. So I think we want to establish that first. I think the other thing is that, again, Kearney's book, it was a little frustrating because I was like, yeah, tell us something we don't know, right? We know that two incomes is better than one, right? At the same time, I mentioned in my op-ed that I was able to accomplish, a lot without being married. And, I was able to, I earned two degrees. I have a graduate degree. I did lots of work in media and what I think are some pretty, big successful places to work. And I was, had a baby later in life through circumstance. And so, I wasn't expecting a lot of this. I do think that, even when you have the best laid plans, as I mentioned earlier, I said, "Okay, I've got a good salary. I'm gonna kind of, things may not work out." I didn't plan for a pandemic, I didn't plan to have a six-week-old in a pandemic. I didn't plan to have to negotiate with a co-parent, right, for example. I didn't plan, I mean, not most people are not gonna be radio hosts who are doing this, but I didn't plan to have a lot of, reaction from the audience, better or worse, for better or worse. So I think if you decide to do it, if you decide to do it, that's one thing. If it happens to you, it's something else. But I do think we have to recognize it is hard. It's a lot of work, and I know people say that, but it is hard. Single parents, if you know any, you know what they want? They want to sit down and eat a meal just without anybody bothering them. They really appreciate that. They wanna be able to, take a break every now and then, and, I mean, it's pretty basic, but I think at the end of the day, we have to acknowledge it is hard to raise a child in this country, and I see a lot of reporting that says younger people are hesitant. And on the one hand, it's a little sad, right? On the other hand, I totally understand it. I totally understand the hesitancy around it. We don't support parents enough.
Yeah. What I really love, another, I love a lot of things, but I also love that you show the messiness of parenting, right? But I'm also curious about why you decided to start this conversation, a necessary conversation. I'm glad you did. But why did you decide to start it in such a very public way? Tell me a little bit about how you landed on this story idea, which is bizarre because it's not even a mystery. We're everywhere, right?
Well, I think part of what I did on the radio, I probably would have, if I was still on air, I probably would have done, a segment on this or 2 or 3. And I did a little something on Substack, but it still didn't feel like anybody was really getting to the core conversation. And as somebody who's spent 20 years in journalism and broadcast, radio, television, print, New York Times, etc., I feel that I have enough information to be able to critique the media. And so when I notice, I pay a lot of attention to who's telling the story, not just what the story is. Obviously, the story is important, but who's telling it? Who's writing it? What position are they taking? Who is, in charge of that part of the narrative? And so to me, the story was itself important. Yes, we want to support single parents, but also my work generally focuses on inequality. That is something that's core to me as a journalist and as a storyteller. And so to me, to have a conversation about single parents without having single parents at the helm of that conversation felt a little weird. It felt like it was lacking, because then I noticed there were a couple of other, pieces and op-eds and I was like, "But where are the single parents themselves, speaking about these?" So I wanted to participate and maybe show a little bit about kind of myself in that process, and because I felt like, well, this is something I can talk about, right? This is something I feel that I know what I'm saying, what I'm talking about.
Your work explores the intersection of gender, race, and class, and really long before we were really even leaning into this idea of intersectionality. Can you tell us a little bit about your takeaway from that research over the years?
I feel like I keep landing in the same place, which is we live in a capitalist country. No, I'm not passing judgment on that. But as a result of the structure that we have, the political and economic structure that we have, and this little thing called the founding of the United States, we were never as different communities, Black people, Latinos, indigenous people have never really been able to catch up to whites in terms of wealth. And there are severe ramifications to that, right? And that when I learned those numbers, when I was working at CNN in particular, and I really started focusing my work on fees and fines and the economic structure of inequality, that's when I knew I couldn't look away. And I looked at my own experience and I thought, well, I did everything I could and I worked as hard as I could. And I spent 20 years in public housing and somehow ended up at the New York Times. But there were other things that have changed that. I'm not there anymore, right? And so I always ask the question, well, how are we supposed to close this gap? Is it through education? Is it through, policy? Is it through just banging on the door and making sure we have a seat at the table, right? Because we've tried all those things and I think, we've made some progress, but not a lot. And so I feel like the conversation goes beyond DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion. I think that's a tiny part of it. My interest is on the core drivers of inequality, the core of it all, it was, I mean, really to go all the way back was chattel slavery. We've never been able to close that gap. The country has really struggled with Black success and Black wealth, and that has extended to other communities of color. That's not to say there aren't success stories. That's not to say we don't have ultra wealthy Black and brown people. We do. But on average, this country still has such a huge
Smiling
gap
bit of hope.
that we really need to focus on bringing that together. And so that's why I center so much of my work on it, because I don't know if it'll ever close in my lifetime.
I'm not sure it will close in mine either. Tanzina Vega is a journalist and former host of award-winning series The Takeaway from WNYC and PRX. It was such a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you so much, Sophia. Thank you for having me.
And that's it for my program today. Remember, you can follow me and the show on Instagram. You can watch and rewatch past episodes on YouTube. Just click subscribe. Thank you so much for watching Feminism Today on Free Speech TV. Join us again next week.